കെ വാര്യ സാറിനെ കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ MGS സഹദേവൻ സാറിനെ കുറിച്ച് ഇന്നലെ വായിച്ചായിരുന്നു.
ശരിക്കും നല്ല നല്ല ടീച്ചേഴ്സ് ആയിരുന്നു അവരൊക്കെ. വളരെ നല്ല എൻ്റെ അടുത്ത ചങ്ങാതികളായിരുന്നു. വാര്യർ സാർ GK വാര്യർ സാറിന്റെ ടീച്ചറാണ്. മറ്റേതെല്ലാം സീനിയർ കൊളീഗ്സ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ.
അപ്പാ സാറിന്റെ അടുത്ത് സാറ് ചെന്നപ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് ആദ്യം ചോദിച്ച ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ഞാൻ സാറിന് പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ, യു ആർ ബോൺ ഔട്ട് ഓഫ് എ വെരി ഡിഫിക്കൽട്ട് സിസേറിയൻ സെക്ഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ കാര്യവും സാർ DM കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ആണ് സാറിന് അത് എന്താണെന്ന് മനസ്സിലായതൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ട്.
അത് അയ്യ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു പാർട്ടിയാണ്. അയ്യ എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ വാര്യർ സാറിന്റെ 10 ഇരട്ടി ബ്രില്യൻ്റ് ആണ് അങ്ങേര്. അങ്ങനെ അനന്താചാരി അങ്ങനെ ആരെയായിട്ടും അടുക്കുകയില്ലായിരുന്നു. അദ്ദേഹമാണ് ഞങ്ങളൊക്കെ ജോയിൻ ചെയ്യുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും അദ്ദേഹത്തെ ചെന്ന് ഓരോരുത്തർ ചെന്ന് മുഖം കാണിക്കണം എന്നാണ് വയ്പ്. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ കയറി ചെന്ന് കഴിഞ്ഞെന്നെ ഇങ്ങനെ, ഓ യു ആർ ദി നെക്സ്റ്റ് ആർന്റ് യു. അപ്പം ഞാൻ ഒന്നും മിണ്ടാകുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ അങ്ങനെ പറഞ്ഞു, മറ്റേ തിരിഞ്ഞു നിന്ന ബാക്കിയുള്ളവർ അവർ ആ നിന്ന ബാക്കി സ്റ്റുഡൻസിൻ്റെ സീനിയർ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് അവരെല്ലാവരും 3 പേര് ന്യൂറോളജിക്കാരാണ്, അമേരിക്കയിലാണ് 3 പേര്. അവർ തിരിഞ്ഞു ചോദിച്ചു, ആസ്കിങ് എ പെർട്ടിനന്റ് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ അബൌട്ട് ഹിംസെൽഫ് എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചു. അപ്പോൾ അവർക്കൊന്നും അറിഞ്ഞില്ല തന്നെ മുകളിലോട്ട് നോക്കിയിരുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ അങ്ങനെ ചോദിച്ചത്, ഈസ് ദി ആൻസർ റിട്ടൺ ഓൺ ദി റൂഫ്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൽ എഴുത്തൻ എൻ്റെ സാവകാശം ചെയ്തു, സാർ വാട്ട് വുഡ് യു ആസ്ക്. ഇയാൾ സോ ആംഗ്രി. ഹി സെഡ് ദെൻ എന്ത് കാര്യമാണ് നിങ്ങളിവിടെ പഠിക്കുന്നതന്നെ, അത് ഇതെന്ന് ചാടിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട്, യെസ് ഐ ഷൽ ആസ്ക് ഹിം, ഡോക്ടർ ആർ യു എ ഡിഫിക്കൽട്ട് ബ്രീച്ച് ബോൺ ഡെലിവറി. എൻ്റെ ആയുസിൽ ആദ്യമായിട്ട് അങ്ങനെ കാണുകയാണ്. ആൻഡ് ദ ഷോക്ക് ഓഫ് മൈ ലൈഫ് വിച്ച് വാസ് ട്രൂ. ആദ്യമായിട്ട് കാണുകയാണ്. 3 കൊല്ലം കഴിഞ്ഞ് ഞാൻ DM പോകാനായിട്ട് വന്നെ അനന്താചാര്യ സാറിനെ ഞാൻ മദ്രാസിൽ ചെന്ന് കാണുന്നു. കണ്ടു കഴിഞ്ഞെന്നെ അങ്ങേര് പറഞ്ഞു, ഓ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു, സാറേ സാറൊന്ന് ചോദിച്ചെൻ്റെ ഐ ന്യൂ ദ ടെക്നിക്ക്. അപ്പം ഇങ്ങനെ വികട സരസ്വതി എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ നാവിൽ എപ്പോഴും ഇതേ പറയുള്ളൂ, ഓ it took 3 years for you to come to that conclusion. എന്താ വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നിങ്ങൾ ആരും നോട്ടീസ് ചെയ്തിരിക്കില്ല, പക്ഷെ അദ്ദേഹം നോട്ടീസ് ചെയ്തു. വളരെ സൂക്ഷിച്ച് നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത്യപൂർവം എനിക്ക് ലെഫ്റ്റ് ഫേഷ്യൽ ടിച്ച് ഉണ്ട്. ഒരു ചെറിയ ഫേസിൽ ഒരു ചെറിയൊരു ടിച്ച് വരും. It is so negligible that nobody can notice it. It can come only after a totally recovered facial palsy. മറ്റ് ഫേഷ്യൽ പാൽസിയുടെ എവിഡൻസ് ഒന്നുമില്ല. So he concluded it should be a very long time past facial palsy, and the commonest cause is a cesarean birth at that time. Difficult cephalopelvic disproportion, forces delivery, facial injury, and hence the problem. അതാണ് അയ്യ. ആൾക്കാരുടെ കൈയെല്ലാം നോക്കിയിട്ട് ഞങ്ങളുടെ ചോദിക്കുന്നത് എന്താ കാരണം ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, പലപ്പോഴും ആഴ്സനിക് പോയ്സണിങ് എല്ലാം അങ്ങനെ തപ്പിയെടുക്കുന്നത് ഞങ്ങൾ ഷോക്ക് അടിച്ച് നിന്ന് പോയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഒരു നോട്ടം ഔട്ട് കംസ് ഡയഗ്നോസിസ്. അപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് തുടങ്ങാറായില്ലേ? 2 മിനിറ്റ്, അതോ 2 ഇനി താമസമുണ്ടോ?
ഇല്ല സാർ, ഒരു സർപ്രൈസ് ഉണ്ട്. ഒരു കാര്യം കൂടെ സാർ, നമ്മുടെ കൂടെ ഒരു കുട്ടിയുണ്ട്. ഷീസ് ഓഫ് ഫാക്കൽറ്റി, ഫിസിയോളജിയാണ്, ഫിസിയോളജിയിൽ AT ആണ്. സാറിന്റെ അച്ഛൻ എഴുത്തിനിരുത്തിയ കുട്ടിയാണ്. സാറിന്റെ അച്ഛൻ എഴുത്തിനിരുത്തിയാണ് കുട്ടീനെ. ട്രിവാൻഡ്രത്തുകാരിയാണ്. താങ്ക് യു സാർ. ആഫ്റ്റർ ദി പ്രോഗ്രാം
സാറിന് താങ്ക്സ് പറയാൻ വേണ്ടി വിളിച്ചപ്പം പറഞ്ഞ, അയ്യോ സാറിന്റെ അച്ഛനാണ് എന്നെ എഴുത്തിനിരുത്തിയത്, ആക്സിഡന്റലി കണ്ടെത്തിയതാണ്.
ശരിക്കും അങ്ങനെ ഒരുപാട് പേരുണ്ട്. അവരൊക്കെ ഞങ്ങളൊരുമാതിരി ഫാമിലി ആയിട്ട് കരുതുന്നതാണ്. അച്ഛനെ എഴുതുന്ന കുട്ടികളെ ഞങ്ങളുടെ തന്നെ കൊച്ചുമക്കളൊക്കെ ആയിട്ടാണ് ഞങ്ങൾ കരുതുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഐ എം സോ ഹാപ്പി. സോ എന്താ കുട്ടി, എന്താ പേര് ഡോക്ടറെ? പാർവതി. ഇയാളെ തിരുവനന്തപുരത്തുകാരിയാണോ? Very good. I am so happy that I could meet you at least this way. എന്റെ ശബ്ദം വലിയ കുഴപ്പമൊന്നുമില്ലല്ലോ.
ഇല്ല സാറേ,
നന്നായിട്ട് കേൾക്കാം.
സാറ് 15 വർഷം മുമ്പ് പഠിപ്പിച്ച അതുപോലത്തെ ശബ്ദം തന്നെ.
80 വയസ്സ് 81 വയസ്സാകാൻ പോകുന്നു. അടുത്ത ഡിസംബറില് 81 വയസ്സാണ്. മൂവിന്ന് ഇത്രയൊക്കെ ചെയ്തു പറ്റിക്കുന്ന തന്നെ വലിയ കാര്യം. എന്താ അങ്ങനെ. എനിക്കിത് വലിയ പരിചയമില്ലാത്തൊരു ഫീൽഡാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ആദ്യം ഒരു ഡിഫറൻസ് പറഞ്ഞത്. പ്രാക്ടിക്കലി ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയാണല്ലോ പഠിക്കുന്നത്. കുഴപ്പമില്ല.
A warm good afternoon to all. We are having the second session of PK Das Master Classes. First of all, I would like to welcome the Honorable Chairman, Advocate P. Krishnadas, Director Dr. C.R. Krishnakumar, all other senior members of the profession from this institution and outside the institution. I welcome all of you to this magnificent session, which is to be conducted by none other than Professor K. Rajashekharan Nair, sir, popularly known as Professor K.R. Nair. He retired from government service as Director and Professor of Neurology, Trivandrum Medical College, and he was the pioneer in starting neurology services in Kerala. He started his career in Calicut, and later he started the neurology department, and with all the teaching troubles, he sold it and produced one of the best departments of neurology at Trivandrum. And most of the neurologists in Kerala are trained by him. And he has written more than 138 scientific publications and also several Malayalam books. And he has been given awards not only from the scientific world but also from the literature. He is the recipient of Sahitya Academy Award for several of his publications, got Best Teacher Award, several national and international awards. So he is the apt person to talk on the subject, and I will not stand between you and Rajashekharan sir or to Rajashekharan sir.
Okay, shall I start?
Okay, sir.
Well, Professor Andrews, I'm exceedingly grateful to PK Das Institute of Medical Sciences and all the important people of the institute for kindly inviting me to the master class. I thank the esteemed institute and my colleague again, Professor Andrews, for this kindness. Thank you very much. I don't know how many people are hearing or listening, and I'm unfamiliar to this new forms of webinars and all. So I'll try to make as much as possible, how best as possible, whatever that is to be conveyed. The topic which I have today is the neurology of higher cognitive functions, like thought, imagination, and others. These are comparatively new topics even for neurologists, because most of the understanding, most of the relevant papers have come after 1990s, maybe late 1990s. Fortunately, it requires a co-understanding of neurology, psychiatry, psychology, and neurosurgery. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Fortunately, I was trained long back in such an institution where neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry, practically all neurosciences work together. The extreme left shows Dr. Baldev Singh, the man the man who started neurology in India, and the second is Prakash Chandan, who is supposed to be the very best neurosurgeon the country has produced. And the third is Professor Nicky, who was the professor of psychiatry in AIMS at the time. Later, he became the director of PGI Chandigarh. He was a great poet as well. In this milieu, when I got my training in neurosciences, it is a combined one. And that is why, unfortunately for me, the neurophysiology of All India Institute of Medical Sciences under Dr. B.K. Anand was an exceedingly stimulating affair. And it is they who taught us that you start from the beginning to understand the major things. So next slide, please. So the next slide, please. We'll start with the basics. The brain volume is hardly 1,400 cc, and the brain weight. It is surprising that a small piece of flesh, which is only 1,350 grams, is capable of imagining the entire universe, imagining the unimaginable, thinking about thoughts which are, not even visualizable. And that is that. In fact, the brain has a surface area of 2,000 square centimeter. That means if you take the Malayalam Manorama paper, one sheet of paper is 2,000 square centimeter. You can't have that sort of a spread. So what I ask you to do is try to crumble the paper. That much of surface area can be scratched, and that is where the brain has 100 billion neurons packed in it. The ultimate functions of the brain are gnosis, praxis, and phases. That means, in the order of it, Ariya, Chaya, and phases, Samsarikya. I want to introduce, next slide please, I want to introduce 2-3 giants in neurosciences, of which the greatest one, next slide please. Next slide please. The greatest one so far is Ramon Cajal, even though it is spelled as Cajal, it is pronounced as Cajal. It is interesting. He was no good as a student, absolutely no good as a student, as is now. In those days also, when parents know that their children are not doing very well, somehow they push them to medicine, and this boy was no good in anything. So his father was a great orthopedic surgeon, put him under a cobbler who said, that child, he is no good, and take him away. Tried in very many other sources, everywhere he failed. Finally, he was put in medical sciences and he passed out. Then nobody wanted him as a surgeon, as a practicing doctor. So his father put him in anatomy department. Within about 2 months' time, they decided, my good heavens, this guy cannot be put in here because he talks nonsense. And the anatomy department had called the father and said, please take your boy away. And then the boy said, look, Dad, I did only what I saw. I drew only pictures of what I saw. And what they drew was eminently good, unquestionably. They were, of course, challenging the thoughts available then. And that is what Ramon Cajal, who got a Nobel Prize later on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Each neuron is 100 microns in size. If you want to have a relationship, the comparison, RBC is only 8 microns, WBC is only 12 microns, and each neuron may be either a unipolar bipolar or multipolar. It has a very long axis and axon and the very many dendrites. Depending on the site, dendrites number can go from a few to thousands, and it is here the synapses do occur. So the synapses will be in numbering trillions minimum. That means the speed at which these impulses travel, especially in thick myelinated ones, can be fascinating in the sense that it could be up to 288 to 300 kilometers to 432 kilometers. That means if I want to travel from Trivandrum to Palakkad, that is only 340 kilometers. In the neurons, the nerve impulses can travel faster than that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next. Next slide, please. Till about 1800 last, till about 1800 last, the whole idea of brain was in a complete mess. People thought that the brain can be so studied by phrenology, ascribing each and every part of the brain to separate functions. They started drawing all these things, and that is called the phrenology. Fortunately, that lasted only till a eminent man by name Broca came in the picture. I just want to elaborate this name. Paul Broca was a surgeon, was nothing to do with neurology. He thought he was a very eminent listener. He used to go to all medical meetings, and there he was a scribe. He would sit down and write whatever that is said there, and he will make notes for the journals. He came to know the people who come and talk do not have fresh ideas, and what he decided was he should have a separate society called the Anthropological Society, which can take fresh ideas from fresh people, and that is how his society moved with initially 18 members. Fortunately for him, there is a gentleman by name Abatin, who was the son-in-law of another great chap by name Sean Boulevard, who said it's the left brain which makes people talk. Since nobody believed, he said, okay, I'm going to give you as a bet 500 francs for anybody who can challenge my idea. It is Abatin who presented one such patient in Paul Broca's meeting, and it was Paul Broca then heard the speech abnormality. He suddenly remembered a patient whom he has in his wards, a man who would talk only one word, 10. He would repeat the word 10, 10, 10. The story is that this man was a diabetic, and the diabetes was not controlled, and hence what he did was he went into a very bad state, and he developed decubitus also, and that is why he came to Paul Broca for treatment. This gentleman was studied by Paul Broca because he had only one word left, that is 10. With that one word, he could convey ideas. He could understand, he could listen, he could perceive whatever that is happening, but he can talk only one word, that is 10. And after his death, the autopsy was done by Paul Broca. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. The autopsy was done by Paul Broca, whose picture is shown on the left side, and he showed that the posterior part or the third frontal convolution of has a lesion. When he presented this, people thought that he was talking nonsense. But it took another 6 months before he got another patient of the same type who also had the same sort of thing. And it is thus Paul Broca finalized that the posterior part of the third frontal convolution is the place for the speech per se. His ideas were taken up mainly by the Germans, and a great chap by name Karl Wernicke founded another group of people who could talk non-stop. They will talk so many words without even understanding. They can talk their syntax, that is the connecting between two words. These words become jumbled, but they cannot understand a single thing which is told to them. And he called it a sensory aphasia. That means the reception part of the speech is completely gone. From these two people, the ideas got accepted, but it took a long time before the next sort of ideas came. Next slide, please. And that is where, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, that is where I want to introduce another great man, the man who we all consider as the greatest luminary in neurosciences. He was a surgeon, neurosurgeon. His name is Wilder Penfield. He was an American, got trained under, you name a person. That is the type of training he had. Cushing, with Osler, with Otfrid Forrester, in the University of Oxford, Hewling Jackson, and that sort of a training he had. And he came back in New York, and he thought that he would get every chance. And the Rockefeller Foundation promised him, look, we are going to build an institute for you, as happens everywhere else. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, and he was invited by the McGill University in Canada, who said, whatever you want, we will provide. And that is why Wilder Penfield went to Canada, and Canadians made him such an important person. Finally, they called the greatest Canadian living. His main concepts are, you can't believe, he opened up the skull of the living, active people. And his main intention was the surgery of the temporal lobe for the epileptic, controlling the epilepsy. When you can see the picture on the right side of the exposed part of the brain, where you find numbers have been given. In those days, there was no way other than this, by putting numbers over there, and that is how he studied the temporal lobe. By stimulating the temporal lobe, he could make people remember whatever that has happened. He could make people remember the sounds they heard, the songs they heard, etc. And deja vu also. But unfortunately, for him, he thought that he could induce new ideas, new concepts, new thinking, new thoughts by stimulating the temporal lobe. Unfortunately, he failed. Most unfortunately, he failed. At the fag end of the career, By the age of 64, he retired as a surgeon, though he continued up to 70 as the director of the Montreal Neurological Institute, where our Jacob Chandri also got trained along under him. And it just so happened that when he retired, he found that his work was totally sad in the sense whatever he thought to be gained by the surgery over the temporal lobe, he could not achieve because new thoughts, new concepts, etc., could not be traced in the temporal lobe. He was invited to many universities, and wherever he went, he repeated the same thing. Finally, his conclusion was so surprising. To me, it seems more and more reasonable to suggest that the mind may be a distinct and different essence than even the brain. This nobody expected him to say. When everybody thought that brain could answer everything that is possible, here was a neurosurgeon who did more than about 12,000 surgery or so, and finally admitting, look, I am unable to find out the thing called mind, even though I look for it. From here, suddenly I have to go to a few other people, of which the most important work, almost succeeding that of Penfield, was in Yale University by Jacobson, Fulton, and others. They did, instead of exploring the temporal lobe where Penfield studied, they explored the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, he explored the doors. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. They explored. Next slide, please. Next. This slide I covered. Next slide, please. Yeah. The leftmost is Carl. No, the one before. Then the one before, please. Yeah. This Carl A. Jacobson, who was in Yale. He got one of the greatest neurophysiologists of all time, Fulton. They went on demonstrating. I don't know whether the brain, the brain sample which I am showing, is visible to the others. If so, kindly tell me. Is it visible or is only slightly visible? Okay. They focus, doesn't matter. They focus the dorsolateral prefrontal gyrus. That means the frontal lobe, the dorsal part, and the lateral part. That is the region where the new thoughts are coming. Second to him was a youngster by name Fulton, and it is the greatest sadness which happened in neurophysiology is this gentleman Fulton. To say the least, he became an ethnologist and he wasted his life. His idea was Jacobson and Fulton, what they did was chimpanzees opening up the skull of these chimpanzees, putting lesions in the dorsolateral prefrontal regions, and make the aggressive chimpanzees very quiet and sedated. It had very, very, very unexpected and exceedingly sad repercussion in the sense that when they reported this in England, there was an audience, a young, very aggressive gentleman by name Egas Muniz. He's a Portuguese chap, and he got up after the speech and he asked only one thing. Yes, you demonstrated by putting lesions in the dorsolateral prefrontal gyrus, you make the monkeys quiet and manageable. My question is, can you do the same sort of surgery in human being and make them sedated? Fulton was shocked because he never expected such a question at all from the audience. He said, I don't know. I have not tried. I don't know. It was this Igaz Moniz who made what is called the frontal leucotomy. That means he opened up the skulls of the people. He was a neurologist, incidentally, and not a, he's a medical neurologist and not a surgical neurologist. And in addition, he had severely bad gout, so much so his fingers could not move. She caught hold of this neurosurgeon and made him do this work, and they did the lobectomy, the frontal lobectomy. To their surprise, despite many untoward incidents, many of the patients they operated, they became totally sedated. What they said as sedated, now in the present way, we can certainly say that is, what should I say, they were totally knocked out. But in those times, when there was no medicine at all for psychiatry, this was at least for the manic patients or the schizophrenic patients who could not be controlled. This is one way by which they could control the anger, emotion, etc. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Almost corresponding with that, there is a young man who came all the way from Europe, frightened of these Nazis, and he came to America. And fortunately, his studies were concentrating mainly on the emotions. It may appear quite, what should I say, sad on the present day way of thinking. The way by which he studied the emotions is by rabies experiments, and he found that the aggressiveness is the resultant of an area which he thought was limbic. Limbic എന്നുള്ള വാക്കിനർത്ഥം ചുറ്റും, around. And what he made out was that limbic, that region will correspond to the parahippocampus, to the hippocampus. From there, it goes via fornix to the mammillary bodies, from there to the thalamus, from there to the cingulate gyrus, back to hippocampus. This is the region which he decided. Most unfortunately, he forgot the pioneers in the field who brought out almost the same sort of idea decades ago, but he found out these are the main regions. By the time this idea was brought out, all over the world, he got so much of a name, and this is even now known as the paper circuit, which I'm sure you might have heard. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, you might not have seen this slide. I told you that Igaz Moniz did the lobectomy. An American by name Walter Freeman, he too was a neurologist. With the help of his neurosurgeon, he thought, why not I do this? After all, we have nothing to offer to the psychiatry patients, and we can try that. What this gentleman did is one of the most cruel, most loathsome experiments, loathsome treatment which happened in neurosciences. After a few trials, he let go his neurosurgery colleague, the man who is in the middle doing this shipping business is Walter Freeman. He thought this lobectomy is this can be easily done by just putting in an ice pick over through the eye, through the eye, and enter the brain from under surface, and by one or two swish regions, they could cut away those regions. The number of people whom he operated runs in hundreds and hundreds, and on the top of it, he went around all psychiatric institutions and he taught the psychiatrists how to do this frontal lobectomy. In fact, they went on calling different names, dichotomy versus lobotomy, to which I don't enter. This is where the scene was stopped at that time, because by the time the work of Fulton, the work of Jacobson was took up by companies, they found out medicines could be produced produced by effectively controlling those sides of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal gyrus, where there are plenty of dopamine sites. If those dopamine sites could be blocked by any drug, that would be adequate to knock down the DLPFC, or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity. And you won't believe, it was sometime in beginning of 1950s, the first drug which is so useful at that time for psychiatric practice came. Since it has very wide action, they called that as they brought out chlorpromazine, and they labeled it as large actil, where the action was supposed to be quite a large one. Now, it is possibly at that time, next slide please, it is possibly at that time, next slide please, next slide please, next slide, okay, it is, next slide please. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, it is at that time the neurochemicals were studied in great depth. There are two types of neurochemicals to which I'll come to. They were called broadly as angels' cocktails, those which do good, and those which do bad, which is called the devil's cocktail. And the so-called angels' cocktail include dopamine, which is acting always as a positive one, serotonin, which is equally a pacifier for that matter. And the third one is oxytocin. These are the main. And in contrast with that, you can see dopamine has not only the pathway for the Parkinsonian extrapyramidal effect, that means from the substantia nigra to the globus pallidus and putamen. In addition, it has pathways to the limbic lobe, the mesolimbical, and it goes to the entire cortex, especially the, as I said, dorsolateral prefrontal region, that is called the mesocortical pathways. In contrast with that, the serotonin has a very much more wider, shall I say, spread of activity, and then the oxytocin. This is a drug. This is a thing which the obstetrician gynecologists are considering their own, what should I say, important one. But in reality, this is the one which causes the feeling of empathy in and what should I say, love, affection, etc., or oxytocin. And in fact, once oxytocin effect starts, it is very long lasting also. I had to go a bit fast forward because I want to touch upon a few other people. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. As I told you, the angels cocktails, dopamine, oxytocin, endorphin. The last one I'll just keep listing. In fact, there are a few names which I want to mention, and they are the one on the one on the man who is standing is Raphael Mashulam, about which I should mention. He's a 90-year-old man now, even now living. He is from Israel, and he found out that there is a chemical which has 10 times the activity of dopamine per se, which produces pleasing effect, which produces exceeding bliss. And he wanted to have a name. There is no name suitable which he could find out in Greek, Latin, or in any other language. So he found the best term which can be used is Anandam and bliss. And that is the word which he used for the chemical which he brought out, which is called Anandamide. Incidentally, just opposite to that, there is another chemical which acting almost against this, which is also having an Indian name, Virodamide, not produced in India, but by this group of scientists. There are two names which I need mention. The first one is who found out dopamine way back. This is Arnold Clayton, and the second one is a man who showed dopamine, L-dopa, can be used for Parkinsonian disease. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a thing which I am ready to bow my head, say salute, sir. He's a great chap, even now living. Fortunately for me,
Hello?
when I asked him
Hello?
to give me his hello, when I asked him to give me his photograph, an autographed photograph, in the same day he sent me one. This gentleman is a very polite, what should I say, very polite research worker in Parma University, Italy. Sorry, by name Giacomo Risolati. It was he who found out that the brain, particularly in the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, etc., there are plenty of neurons which can mimic whatever that is happening around them. Hence, he called it is mirror neurons, as if they are reflecting. You see somebody crying, automatically you also feel terrible. You feel somebody having severe pain, shut eye, and you will find the pain, you almost feel the same sort of pain. And that is the mirror focus, which is now accepted as the originator for a great amount of evolution of mankind, including that of speech. Whatever they heard and they studied, they repeated whatever they heard, and that is why even speech came into existence. Next slide, please. This man's name would not have, what should I say, become important, but for again an Indian, a chap by name V.S. Ramachandran, about which you have all heard, his Phantoms in Brain and other books almost everybody must have read. Now I come to the main topics which I thought I will deal: thoughts, imagination, etc. When we say thoughts and thinking, we take it for that matter, it is such a simple process. My good heavens, it is not. The psychological definition of thought is, it is a mental process in which beings, people who are living, form psychological association and models of the world. Thinking is manipulating already available information. When we form new concepts, engage in problem solving, thinking automatically produces more thinking. Actually, it's a symbolic response to stimuli. This is where I have a little disadvantage. I have a little disagreement also. It is mentioned that it is a symbolic response to any stimuli. The difficulty is that thinking need not always be secondary to external stimuli. It can be self-generated also. You think of it. You need not think always only after a stimulus has entered you. Even when you sit quietly and talk and doze off, thoughts will come in tens and tens and tens of thousands. That is why the last one is the response to stimuli need not be clicking. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Here, one more person's name I want to. Carl Jacobson and John Fulton, when they were working in Yale, they produced great work. As I told you earlier, Fulton became little difficult to manage in the department because of his problem. So they took him away from physiology and made him a better position and sent him out of physiology for that matter. But the work which they started, Jacobson and Fulton started, great people, great work. It was continued by a very aggressive lady by name Patricia Rakic, Patricia Goldman Rakic. She continued the work, but she had a difficulty. They could get Jacobson and Fulton could do anything with animals. The animal experiments was allowed and it was not problematic. By the time Patricia Rakic came into Yale, she found that to do the animal experiments, she has to undergo so much of what should I say, administrative difficulties. So she went in for the new experimental techniques, like including fMRI. And their work is so fascinating. It was she who found out so many things, of which again the place is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. They found by lesioning the this side, DLPFA, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the animals do develop something very peculiar. They see, they take the food which is placed in front of them. They know it is there. And even if, what should I say, they are, what should I say, they are shaded, their eyes are shaded, the food is there. But surprisingly, once they stop seeing, they forget about a whole lot of things which are in front of them. That is, out of sight, out of mind. This is an epoch-making experiment done by Patricia. Unfortunately, she too died rather unfortunately because of a car accident when she was hardly around 60, 62, something like that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is what I was going on telling. The dry region over there is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In the physiology textbooks, you don't see this sort of arrows. But these are the things which Patricia and others have been trying to tell. This dorsal prefrontal cortex is so extensive connections right from occipital lobe to parietal lobe, the temporal lobe to the frontal lobe, and this part, the lowest part is marked in the black, the orbitofrontal cortex. Also, they congregate over that region, and that produces the, what should I say, ability or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Here I want to start for a second and then want to go for something. After all, when you are hearing a sound, you think that you understand it instantaneously. Honestly, that is not right. There is a delay. The delay can be from 150 millisecond to 200 millisecond. That means in reality, we are feeling the present that is past. That means the present, what we understand, is already gone. It is the past. Now, what is thinking? And more the subcutaneous route, a stimulus is needed for understanding, more will be the delay. The delay in every synapse is about 0.5 millisecond. So you can think of trillions of those synapses. The delay can be very much aggressive. Here, some of the responses cannot afford to have the delay. Next slide, please. Say, for example, next slide, please. Yeah. Say, for example, you can't wait. Even the 200 millisecond can be fatal. Say, for example, you suddenly hear a very loud noise near you, and that will produce what is called a startle response, which has low number, almost a very minimal number of neurons to manage. It goes from the cochlear nucleus straight to the brainstem. When the reticulospinal pathway, it comes down and it produces a startle response. It takes so much less time than the thinking. There is another pathway which is also not told very emphatically by many, but whatever you get as a stimulus has will be reaching the region which is called amygdala, which chooses whether it is a dangerous stimulus or not. Its responses are not related to the sensory cortex and make it understanding. It comes straight, the responses come straight and produces the amygdala response, which is not as fast as the first one or the startle response, but it is quick enough. And the third one is, next slide, please. And the third one is, next slide, please. Yeah. Here comes the thought. People say that you get somewhere about 6,000 thoughts per day. I don't know. People are not very sure whether it happens. Thoughts do happen in sleep also. I'll come to the point a little later on. And do thoughts need speech and language? Do we necessarily think in words and language? In fact, about 65% of the people don't use the language for thinking. They have what is called a visual thinking. And the neuropsychologists has brought out their own idea that there is what is called a language of thought, which they call tentatively as mental age. I skipped that because there is not a very convincing way of doing. I'm not sure whether the 6,000 per day of thoughts is a good enough way. It should be far more than that. About most of the thoughts just wither away like the Apu Pandadis, they just fly away, get lost somewhere and gone. Some, very few, result in action. And it is exceedingly few which are retained for a future use. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. The speed of thought, as I told you, again, the neural pathways are accepted, and more the number of neurons, more the delay will occur. The question is this calculation of studying the peripheral nervous system's capacity necessarily applicable to brain? Unfortunately, I don't think so. Say, for example, the speed of the thought, at least to many philosophers and many thinkers, is faster than even light. Say, for example, if I want to think of the places where I've stayed, it's easy. I know that I was in F-16 quarters in Suffering Enclave. I was in the Southern General Hospital, Glasgow. I was in Queen Square. I was in a place called Alki, Benghazi. I was in B11 quarters in Calicut. The whole places where I go, in a fraction of a second, and I come back and I am comfortable. So the speed of thought is exceedingly faster than even light for many. Next slide, please. There are next slide, please. There are next slide. Yeah, I am skipping the thought disorders, like the content thought disorders and formal thought disorders, because they are mainly in the psychiatry field, so I skip it. Next slide, please. Thoughts occur non-stop. It is difficult to stop thinking even for a short time, even though I said as earlier 6,000 per day, but in reality it can be very, very much more. Thoughts can be exceedingly unpleasant also, sometimes useful, but sometimes exceedingly unpleasant. I'll give you a couple of thoughts, one of which is a man by name, the greatest short storyteller of all time, Gita de Maupassant, who became syphilitic, who developed grandiose thoughts, and he thought that his urine contained precious thoughts, precious germs, and he wouldn't want to waste the urine. And he thought that planting small pebbles in the hospital front yard will make newer and newer Maupassant by the next ray. Thoughts in GPI, even though it is called as a grandeur thought, it need not always be so. Sometimes it may be just the other way around. a less thought. Next slide, please. Thoughts in mania. Thoughts in mania. Next slide, please. Next, go, friend. Next slide, please. Thoughts in mania, yeah, would be racing thoughts. As I said, in hypomania, the thoughts can be exceedingly sometimes useful also. Perhaps Professor Andrews might remember, I'm sorry, one of my friends who came from UK, he was the greatest neurologist of that particular period. The amount of work which he has done is so phenomenal. We are contemporaries, classmates, and we used to be, what should I say, literally afraid of his capacity. Later on, he came to know that he was basically a hypomaniac and hence his function. And some of the thoughts which are happening in MDP or hypomania can be useful, can be exceedingly useful. And there's a lovely book by name, The Test with Fire by Ray Jamison. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next, yeah. Sometimes the thought can be terrible. There is a disease which is called Cotard syndrome. I don't know how many of you have heard. This is what is called a walking corpse syndrome, where people think that they are already dead, their bodies are rotting, they want to be thrown off, their internal organs have already decayed and gone, and it's a distorted reality. And I want to introduce another book by name by an Indian called Anil Anandaswamy, The Man Who Was Not There. There he brought out a lovely Buddhist story. Two Vetalas, one Vetala coming with a corpse, and after a few seconds, another Vetalam comes in. They start fighting who brought the corpse. And the first Vetalam asked the man who was in that room, who sought shelter in that room for the night. He was afraid of these Vetalas. He was asked who brought the corpse. He thought that he will tell the truth. He said, yes, the first Vetalam brought the truth, the corpse. The angry second Vetalam pulled out a hand from his body and started eating. Angered, the first one pulled out the hand from the corpse and fixed it to him. And this continued till the entire body is eaten. But the man says his body is retained with all the limbs. The next day, when he woke up, the Vetala disappeared. He started wondering, who am I? I am already eaten by the Vetalas. Whatever that is left here is the parts fixed by the Vetalas. And this question is continuing. There is another condition which is much worse, which is called cynomeglia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is called cynomeglia. It has a wonderful another name, what is called apotemnophilia, the body integrity dysphoric disorder, which was initially described in 1997, where people go to doctors and demand that their normal body parts should be chopped off. The man who, this has very many names, like the body integrity dysphoria, and the man who popularized this idea is V.S. Ramachandran. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. We want to skip through rapidly for another reason. My phone is getting, very fastly discharging. Anyway, fantasy is a faculty or activity of imagining the impossible or improbable things. Suppose if I ask you, can you with shut eye remember your sister, your house? You can certainly do it. You can certainly do it. But you don't know there are any number of people around who just can't do it. The moment they shut their eye, even though they know everything about their sister, their home, their place, the work, everything, but they just cannot visualize mentally what is happening. And this condition is called aphantasia. Like the mirror neuron system, people thought there could be an imaginary neuron system as well. Next, and where it is in the hippocampus, amygdala, entorhinal cortex, and parahippocampal gyrus. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. I want to quote Wordsworth. For oft when I couch I lie in vacant or pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And this is a fantasia about which I mentioned. We want to skip very fast because the phone is getting dead very fastly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah. I think I am coming to the last part of it, the neurology of creativity. Creativity is inventiveness, sargatmakata. A use of imagination or original ideas to create something new. It comes only for people who are already prepared their minds for such a thing. The processing of awareness is of two parts. Say, for example, you enter a room, you find something. You can have two ways of understanding. Either a bottom-up processing. You find each and every item of that and then start wondering and make the whole thing. Or if you already know, you see one part, you know the rest of it. That is called top-bottom, top-down processing. Every act of creation is in reality an act of destruction also. Every piece of information which we get is broken down to the smaller and smaller one, and they just disappear. They are not available. Next slide, please. 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 However much, no, the one before. However much, the one before. Yeah. It is not a logic that is creating. From logic, you can make from point 1 to point B. But imagination is creative. Insight and intuitions don't come with strainful thinking. Say, for example, you want to create something new. However much you try, morning, day, in and out, you go on thinking. There is no way by which you can have a creative thinking. But then what you do is, you think about it, then you walk away. You go with your friend. You take your wife and go out for a ride. You swim. You do heavy manual work. Or you sleep. Suddenly, with no warning, you get a creative spark which is to say the least fascinating. You know that if I want to put a simile, the creative capacity is lurks inside your brain. She is not visible to you. But abruptly, she comes with all glaring. And this is the aha moment by which you get, my good heavens, this is what it is. In sleep, it does come, and it lasts only for some time. And it's necessary that the ideas which you get over that particular period when you wake up, you better sit down and write it down. Otherwise, you will forget it the next morning totally. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Creativity can be exceedingly high in narcolepsy. In the REM sleep, creativity can be exceedingly high, and bipolar disease also. Say, for example, you have Vincent van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, etc. And another point, the last line which I have put up. In many conditions where the frontotemporal dementias come, when the inhibitory capacity of the frontal lobe is lost, the creative capacity comes on like a jiffy. Those people who never ever drawn anything in their life, they become brilliant painters. And this is the work done by Bruce Miller and others sometime in late 1990s. Now it is generally accepted that in FTD, this is a common affair. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. I think, thank God that I know that I rushed a bit. I'm sorry for it because, no, the one before. The one before. Yeah. I am a stranger to myself. My ears wander over my voice. I see my inner self smiling, crying, braving, and fearing. But I remain unknown, engulfed in tremendous silence. My thoughts are strangers to my body, and I stand before the mirror. I see something in my face which the soul does not see, and I find my eyes what my inner self does not find. The beautiful quotation by Khalil Gibran. I love writing. I thought I'll put them my ideas in Malayalam for that matter in a book form, and I titled as Nyan Enna Bhavam. I too have been waiting for a long time. Next slide, please. This book, I thought at the fag end of my career, I'd not be able to finish, but I did. And I'm also waiting for the book to come out. And thank you very much for patient listening. I don't know how much time I have taken, 1 hour plus. And I thank you very much again. I must express my thanks to the master class of Dr. P.K. Das Institute and to Dr. Andrews for giving me the opportunity to talk. Thank you very much. Hello. 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 കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ട്.
Sir, this was an excellent talk, sir. Sir has taken from neurons to imagination and creativity. And as Albert Einstein said, everything in this world is by our thoughts. And if we want to change the world, we have to change our thoughts. Sir has made a thought-provoking session, and I think there will be few comments or doubts from the audience. So if sir has got time, we'll spend few minutes on that.
Please.
Over to the audience. Okay, sir.
There is a small problem here. That's why I rushed through. My phone is practically getting dead. Hello?
Questions?
Hello?
Sir, we can hear you, sir.
Eh?
Anybody else got any comments or doubts?
Questions are unnecessary. Okay. Any questions?
Please make it fast because at any second it can go.
Start. So we'll conclude the session, sir, and I was your last student, and I am thank very much for your kind acceptance of our invitation, and we'll go to the concluding the remarks by Dr. Parvati.
I feel privileged to thank our honorable speaker, Dr. K. Rajashekharan Nair, sir, for your thought-inducing talk. No words are enough to describe your depth of understanding of the subject, sir. We all feel grateful to be present here today to listen to your incredible talk. Once again, on behalf of all, I thank you, sir. I take also this opportunity to thank our beloved Director Operations, Dr. R.C. Krishnakumar, sir, and our Principal, Dr. M.A. Andrews, sir, for conceiving the idea of Masterclass series, which gives us opportunity to hear from many stalwarts in medical field. I thank all the HODs, faculty members, students for your participation, and I thank all the office staff and IT department for their cooperation. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. We expect few more talks from you at a later time, sir.
Okay, I'll do it. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
സാർ എന്നൊരു കാര്യം ഹീലിംഗ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് സംഭവം പറഞ്ഞില്ലേ?
ആ.
ഒരു